Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the history of the weapon, the AR-15, one of the most sold rifles in the country and also one of the most controversial weapons that we have for its frequent use in mass shootings. My guest for this is Zusha Elinson, who's a reporter with the Wall Street Journal, and also, along with Cameron McWhirter, authored a new book called American Gun: The True Story of the AR-15. Zusha Elinson, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you so much for having me, Mitch. As a longtime Bay Area resident and journalist, it's just a real honor to be on your show.
It's good to have you, and thank you for saying that. Speaking of longtime Bay Area resident, Bay Area will play a role, actually, in the conversation that we're going to have, especially when we get sort of in the 80s and 90s. But before that, California itself is a significant place. Sort of the earliest version of what would become the AR-15 comes from the state of California.
Absolutely. So, when we set out to write this book, we wanted to know how we had got to the place where we are now. We have this gun, the AR-15, that everyone recognizes. Millions of people hate it. Millions of people love it. It's used in a lot of mass shootings. It's become really the center of our nation's bitter debate over firearms. And we want to know, how did we get here? And that story begins in a garage in Los Angeles. In the 1950s, there was a guy named Eugene Stoner. He was a former Marine, a very gentle guy. He didn't like to swear. When he got upset, he would say, "Boy, that frosts me." He didn't spank his kids, but he was fascinated with the way that firearms worked. It's all he thought about. How can I solve engineering riddles related to firearm design? He would be out to dinner with his family in Los Angeles. He'd be scribbling gun designs on the restaurant tablecloths. His wife would say, "Don't write on the restaurant tablecloths." He said, "It's fine, they can wash it out." And that's all he thought about. At home, he was writing down designs. And every day after work, he would go to work making aircraft valves. He would go to his little detached garage and think about how to make the next best gun, how to improve upon the guns of the day. And what's interesting is he had no formal training in gun design. He had no college education. And instead of limiting him, this allowed him to think outside the box. So for centuries, rifles had been made of wood and heavy steel. We all know what they look like. But Stoner thought, why not take that steel part? There's a big heavy steel part in the middle of the rifle, one of the most important parts, called the receiver. And he said, why don't I make that out of aluminum? I'm using this lightweight material at work, making aircraft parts. I'm sure it could withstand the pressures of explosion of the gunpowder. And lo and behold, he started replacing heavy metal parts with aluminum. And that was his real first big step to creating the AR-15, which at the time was this very lightweight, easy to shoot rifle that was very futuristic, almost a space age gun at the time. The next thing he did, which was really interesting, is he was really interested in efficiency and simplicity as a designer. One great story that exemplifies that is he never wore ties, and he never wore real bow ties, but he wore a clip-on bow tie because he didn't want to catch the tie in the machinery, and he thought a real bow tie would take too long to tie on. So he liked the most efficient solution as possible. He'd wear a clip-on bow tie. And he applied that idea to design as well, and he redesigned the interior of the gun. So he used the force, the energy from the exploding of each shot to move a bunch of parts inside the gun, expel the spent casing, and reload the next round. And he came up with this very ingenious system to do that, that he later patented. And these ideas are taking shape in his garage, but they really come to fruition when he joins a tiny little startup in Hollywood, of all places. I mean, it's really interesting, the history of gun design, right? You think of the Northeast, Connecticut Valley, all these historic gun makers. But at the time, Los Angeles was booming after World War II. There was all these aircraft companies. There was a lot of people working in the defense industry. And they started a little tiny startup called Armalite. This is in Hollywood. And they're working away, and they're trying to come up with futuristic weapons and very lightweight weapons. and they're getting nowhere. They're really getting nowhere. It's a bunch of little brainiacs along with Stoner, but they're not getting anywhere. When all of a sudden, there's a long story, but what's important to know here is that the military at this time is searching for a new rifle. So at the time, during World War I, our troops had used this very heavy M1 Garand. It's like big, heavy wood and steel rifle, weighed about 10 pounds unloaded. And as we're coming, it's about 10 years after World War II, 15 years, and the military still doesn't have a new rifle for its soldiers. And there's little wars popping up around the world. There's a lot of, the Cold War is really, really coming on strong. And some generals in the U.S. military believe we need a rifle that can, counteract the AK-47 that's being used by these communist rebels around the world. And the AK is this somewhat lighter rifle that can shoot a lot of bullets at somewhat close range. So the generals are like, we need a lightweight rifle that can shoot a lot of bullets that soldiers can easily carry. And so they go to Stoner, this general, and he says, can you build me this rifle? And that's really the beginning of the AR-15.
So many ironies in there, including just about Eugene Stoner himself. You started off by saying he's actually a very gentle man, never spanked his children, never said expletives, however, had this real fascination with guns.
Yeah, he's an interesting character. He's kind of a classic American inventor in the way that all he thought about every day was mechanisms. He liked shooting guns. Sure, he went hunting with his wife, but he was more fascinated with the way that they worked. But yeah, as a personality, he was a very gentle guy. He's kind of slightly rounded. He has a very dry sense of humor. But he didn't think a lot about the larger implications of weapons design. We spoke with one of the people who worked closely with him, Jim Sullivan, a guy who helped him draft the design for the AR-15. And we asked him, what did you think about when you were building these guns for the military? And he said, well, I think about mechanisms, and I usually assume the U.S. is on the right side of the whatever conflict is going on.
And is it so? Eugene Stoner is paying attention to the world. He is. I mean, this is obviously in the midst of the Cold War, the Korean War. He's building this to fight communists, basically.
Yeah, he was a very patriotic guy in the sense that he wanted the U.S. military to have the best rifle as possible, and he saw it as his life's work. Later, he writes this letter to the military talking about his legacy, and he sees it as his life's work is providing U.S. soldiers with a superior weapon than they had in World War II, and he didn't have any moral qualms with that at all.
Is the M16 the precursor to the AR-15?
Yeah, so there's all these terms get thrown around. They're hard to understand. So let me break it down very simply. So Stoner, they invent what's called the AR-15, and it's called the AR-15 because the AR stood for either Armalite Research or Armalite, the name of the company, and 15 because it was the 15th weapon they came up with in this little idea lab. But then once the military adopts the gun, they rename it the M16. And then confusingly, when companies start to sell the semi-automatic version on the consumer market later, they call that the AR-15. So it's a little confusing. But essentially, the military version in the 1960s, when it gets first adopted, right, you can shoot the gun on semi-automatic, which means that you pull the trigger, one bullet flies out, pull the trigger, another bullet flies out, or on fully automatic, you pull the trigger and a stream of bullets fly out. And the version that was sold to consumers, which we'll talk about in a second, is just semi-automatic, one shot per trigger pull.
Tell me more about Jim Sullivan. You mentioned him earlier. He was still alive, and still alive, I think, now. So you were able to talk to him in researching this book.
Yeah, Jim Sullivan. So we, in doing this history, we sought out original sources, right? We were able to speak with Stoner's family, get access to his personal papers, And Jim Sullivan is the last living member of this Armalite team who worked on this gun. So it was really important that we spend time with him. And I went out to Arizona in Prescott where he lives and spent time with him in his gun workshop there. He has hundreds of patents on gun related things. And he told me incredible stories about working with Stoner. I mean, he just smiled so broadly as he explained how Stoner's gas system worked. He's showing me all the parts of the guns, the drawings he's made. He's like an excited professor, just beaming. But what was interesting is about a couple days into our visit, he just unprompted looked down at the ground and just became very sad about the current state of affairs. And, at the beginning of our book, we have a quote from Oppenheimer, right? His thoughts about creating the bomb and the implications for society. And in this moment, Jim Sullivan was just thinking about, what responsibility do inventors have to society, and especially gun designers. And it was a very profound moment to be there with him as he explored that. So that comes, towards the end of the book, but we think it's really important to ask that question, Our book's about this really amazing technological invention, but what are the social implications?
And what was your sense of it? What was his regret? What was it? This gun has commonly been used in mass shootings, or the political firestorm that this gun's about, or both?
He felt mainly sad about the mass shootings. He said every time there was a school shooting, he just felt like that people who design these guns, he said, give mass shooters the tools that they need to do what they do. Let me pull it up. I can read you what he said. He's in the gun world, right? And he works with guns, and he supported gun rights for a long time. But I think the mass shootings really deeply affected him. And he said, every gun designer has a responsibility to think about what the hell they're creating, is what he said.
That's interesting. So he's not hardcore gun rights active guy anymore.
Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of one of those things, right, where in America we like to have either pro or anti, and that's kind of a problem with our public discourse. And I think the truth about humans is that we're complex and we can hold two opposing ideas within ourselves. And I think that was what was going on here.
When you read that quote, I'm skipping forward here, so we might skip around the timeline.
That's fine, yeah.
But I couldn't help but think him saying the gun manufacturers should be thinking about the weapons that they're making. I can't help. I was a Capitol Hill reporter back around 2005, I think, when this happened. The assault weapons ban, something that we'll also be talking about, had expired because it only had a sunset provision of 10 years once it was adopted. It had expired. And I'll never forget this day because the Senate was about to vote on a measure to give gun manufacturers immunity from how their weapons are used. And it was and I'll never forget this because it was a far gone conclusion that it was going to pass. And my deadline was about 45 minutes before the vote was going to occur. And because it was a foregone conclusion, this was going to pass because so many senators were supporters of the NRA and this is what the NRA wanted. I finished my story as though it had passed. And that was a lesson I learned in a very hard way because at the very last minute, Dianne Feinstein, who recently passed away, was able to get an amendment to this measure to give immunity to gun manufacturers to once again reinstate the assault weapons ban. And the NRA found out about it 15 minutes before the vote occurred and sent out their notes to all the senators. And the entire measure, and it's because of this amendment, went down. And my story was in a bad state at that. It was a lesson never to do that again. But I was going to save that for later. But I couldn't help but bring it up now because, again, this original measure, which eventually has passed, gun manufacturers do now have immunity. It's interesting to hear one of the creators of the AR-15 say that manufacturers need to be thinking about how their weapons are used.
Well, that's a great story that you tell there. Not only, well, first of all, it's a great story for any reporter who's been a reporter, right? To save time, we all pre-write stories, and then usually it happens. But sometimes, like you described, something quite remarkable happens. But you hit upon a key moment in the history of the AR-15. So around, let me back up I'll wind up to that moment, but I think it's a really key moment you brought up. So after, we'll get back to Vietnam, but essentially after Vietnam, there's one company, Colt, and they start selling the AR-15 to consumers, and it doesn't sell very well. I mean, back then, hunters really liked their, woodstock rifles, polished gleaming steel. They had no use for this gun, which was made of plastic and aluminum. It looked kind of chintzy to them. It wasn't that great for shooting large game either, so it just was kind of relegated to this side role in the consumer market. And even, once Stoner's patent expired in 1977, there's a couple other companies that got in, but even so, they were kind of shunned. Even at, they're kind of the bad boys of the gun industry. One of the early AR-15 makers, he describes being at NRA shows, NRA conventions. They have a convention every year. He's displaying his wares on his table there, and NRA members come up and give him the finger. They don't want to see this military-style gun at their convention. This was, for them, guns were about sportsmen, being sportsmen, hunters, that sort of thing. And it didn't fit their image at that time in the 80s and 90s. Now, we'll get into this a little later, but the gun gets banned for 10 years. But at the time that you're talking about, this is the huge fulcrum almost from which the AR-15 goes from being a shunned niche product to a huge mainstream commercial blockbuster. And one of the big reasons was, A, that the assault weapons ban sunsetted right before the vote you spoke about, and B, that Congress passed this law giving gun manufacturers immunity from any lawsuits related to their guns being used in criminal acts. And those two pieces of legislation, one passing, one sunsetting, really set the table for mainstream gun makers to get into the business of making AR-15s. Before that, it had been made by smaller gun makers who were not sort of, they weren't the movers and the shakers in the gun industry. They weren't the big players. But after those political and cultural, there's also some cultural shifts. The AR-15 becomes a very mainstream product. So it's a really important moment.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with Zusha Elinson. He's a reporter with the Wall Street Journal, and he's co-author, along with Cameron McWhirter, of a book that we are in conversation about, American Gun, The True Story of the AR-15. That's important. How is it that it becomes more of a commercial gun after this? Is there a PR campaign for this gun? What happens?
Yeah, so a big cultural change that happened was 9/11. So we didn't get into this, but I'll just briefly say that Stoner's gun was adopted by the military, renamed the M16, and sent to Vietnam, where it performed horribly. And
horribly? Yeah,
so it's a dramatic and terrifying story. We're going back to the 60s for a moment here. The military didn't like Stoner. They didn't like these outsiders trying to propose that they use this new lightweight gun. Military, they were making their own rifle that they wanted to use. It was heavy wood and steel, much like the one used in World War II. It was not very different. So when McNamara and the whiz kids get a hold of Stoner's rifle and they really want it, the entrenched military bureaucracy really digs in their heels. And eventually, once the gun is adopted, they make a number of changes to Stoner's gun before it goes into combat. And these Stoners prove disastrous. They change the type of ammunition that's used. And that's one of the worst changes. Once our soldiers are over in Vietnam, and whatever you think about that conflict, soldiers going into war, they expect their gun to work. And we interviewed Marines who went over to Vietnam, and they are awakened by gunfire. They take their gun out, they shoot a couple rounds, and all of a sudden their rifle's jamming. And my co-author interviewed this Marine who was getting fired upon by Viet Cong. His gun's not working. He does the only thing he can to defend himself. And this is a little gruesome, let me warn you. He ends up beating the guy with the butt of his rifle and then stabbing him with the barrel. So Marines were outraged, and this led to congressional hearings, all these guns not working. It was a huge scandal, but because there was so much going on in the 1960s, and because of a very effective cover-up by the military, it didn't really get the full hearing that you might expect. I mean, we dug through National Archives and found memos where the military describes how they're going to try to cover this up, describes how they knew it was a problem before they sent the guns to Vietnam and didn't do anything. But all that was to say is that after Vietnam, this gun had a kind of stain.
I mean, that's a potential turning point in history right there.
Yes, a huge moment. And in terms of the commercial market, why it's a huge moment is because a lot of Vietnam veterans coming back wanted nothing to do with this gun, right? Why would they buy the civilian version of this gun that had failed them at their most critical moment in their life? So it really had a stain from that for a long time. Now fast forward to 9/11, and we have this rally around the flag moment. A lot of Americans are watching TV. They're seeing troops being sent off to the Middle East, and they see them carrying this gun. And suddenly, it's American heroes carrying this gun to a large portion of the population. Obviously, people have very differing views of war and so forth, but to a large portion of the population, they see soldiers carrying this gun in what they believe is a righteous war, and that bad taste from Vietnam is washed out of people's mouths. And so veterans coming back home, they want to own the civilian version of this AR-15. People who want to be like soldiers or who admire soldiers also want to buy this type of gun. And if you remember, after 9/11, we're on a war footing. There's all this consumer stuff around war. There's Hummers are being sold. People love camo clothing. And so AR-15s fit very naturally into this. They look kind of tough and martial. And so that really sets off the buying of AR-15s by the American public. Then what happens? The assault weapons ban falls apart. And maybe we should actually talk about why it doesn't get renewed, because that's a really interesting story. But yeah, certainly 9/11 is the beginning of a cultural shift that makes the AR-15 much more palatable.
So tell me, why doesn't it get renewed?
So one of the big things that I was really interested in going into this book, I wanted to know, history is so fascinating because things change so quickly, right? I wanted to know, how was there the political will in Washington to pass a federal assault weapons ban in 94? When you look at politics around guns in Washington, barely anything passes anymore. I wondered, how did that happen? And we look back in the 1990s, and it was fascinating. For people who lived it, they know what happened, right? Crime was rising in American cities. There was a lot of concern about gun violence. And crucially, police officers were very concerned about gang members and others using these types of guns. Now, they were mainly concerned about AK-47s, other types of, these are all kind of like military-style guns that are semi-automatic, have large magazines. They were worried about gang members shooting at them. And the police officers really rallied to support the federal assault weapons ban. And that was really the crucial political linchpin that got it passed, right? Because the NRA was very strong at the time. Democrats had wanted to restrict guns for a long time, but the police officers coming in really made the difference. They testified at Capitol Hill. They would be by Bill Clinton, when he was stumping for the assault weapons ban. And, it passed with Republican support as well, which is interesting too, back then. What's also interesting about the federal assault weapons ban, which, just to explain what it is, it banned about 19 guns by name, and it also banned a certain type of gun, what they called an assault rifle. And what happened, though, is that it turned AR-15s into a political symbol immediately. So at the time in the 90s, there was about 400,000 AR-15s in the country, not that many. And they were owned by who? They were owned by collectors, a few veterans, extremists, survivalists. It was a very niche crowd. But the moment that Bill Clinton and Democrats and some Republicans got up there and said, we want to ban this gun went from an afterthought to becoming a political symbol. We talked to a guy in Washington State, and he owned the gun just to shoot it at the range. He didn't think anything of it. But as soon as politicians got up there saying, you can't have this gun, he was like, oh, no, you can't have my gun. This is a line in the sand I'm not going to allow. And he was among the many voters that voted the Democrats out of office after they passed the assault weapons ban. I mean, if you'll remember in the 1994 midterms, the Democrats got annihilated, one of the biggest losses in history. And it was largely because of the passing the assault weapons ban. And so that sets the stage for a number of other things that happen later in the book.
With the onset of the war on terror, do they fix the problems with the AR-15 that was experienced during the Vietnam War?
Yeah, so, in the years, even in the later parts of the Vietnam War, they had fixed the problems. We interviewed soldiers who fought in the Middle East, and the gun worked pretty well. There's debates among gun aficionados and military types. Do they like an AK-47 better, AR-15 better? It's kind of Chevy versus Ford, but certainly the big problems were fixed. It worked very well.
Tell me more about Colt. I think Colt acquired the licensing to the AR-15 back in 1959. Do they still? Who owns the licensing now?
So yeah, Colt. So Stoner and his colleagues, they were trying to get the military to adopt it. It didn't. They couldn't. Colt eventually buys the licensing, and they make the gun for the military. They basically make all their money selling this gun to the military. After 1977, Stoner's patent on the internal gas system expires, and anyone can make this gun. Colt holds on to the military contract for a while, but all types of companies are making this AR-15 for consumers.
How significant is that in the story?
Yeah, it's important because fast forwarding to where we left off in the early 2000s, you have these small companies, they start to make the AR-15, and then you have these larger companies getting into the business. And one of the things that people don't understand about why this was so appetizing to large gun companies is that this is a very profitable product, more so than other types of guns. And I think it's important for people to understand that. I mean, you have to understand the larger economic forces at play. So this gun is easy to make. You can make the parts at a machine shop. You don't need expensive machinery or skilled labor. And the margins were about double that of a normal rifle. And so once the large gun companies saw that, they were eager to rush in. And, by the late 2000s, every gun company is making a version of this gun. So what's happening in the late 2000s? You had this interest start from some portions of the public, but politics really supercharges the market. Barack Obama is running for election in 2008, and the NRA launches an all-out campaign on him, saying he's going to take people's guns. In reality, he was extremely moderate on guns, as you'll remember. Barely spoke about them on the campaign trail. Nevertheless, people rushed to the stores to buy AR-15s. And this was, really proved to gun makers how important politics was in selling guns. Every time there was a Democrat running for office, for the White House, who called for more gun restrictions, or even not, gun sales spiked. Every time there was a mass shooting and there were calls for a new assault weapons ban, AR-15 sales spiked. So they're very cyclical, and as we're coming to the late 2000s, they're just selling like hotcakes.
Tell me about I'm going to say advertising guns, but maybe it's not exact correct way to phrase this, because I'm specifically trying to get at the video game industry and this mending with guns and working with gun manufacturers.
Yeah, that was one of the most interesting things we uncovered in this book. So as you'll know, that the NRA and the gun industry often blames violent video games for violence in our country. That's, after a mass shooting, they'll say, well, violent video games are to blame. But what we found in our research was that, in fact, some of the largest gun makers in our country worked hand in hand with video games to place their products in video games. And we're not just talking the images, name brand products with their names. And we were able to look at internal memos from the largest gun maker at the time. They were called Freedom Group. They later called Remington. They're this big gun conglomerate backed by private equity. And we were able to look at internal company memos where they talk about why they're trying to place their guns in video games. And why is that? They said they want to win their fair share of younger customers. They were afraid at the time that gun buyers were aging out. They wanted to target a younger audience. And they signed specific deals to, put different guns in Call of Duty, which is a very famous video game, played by tens of millions of people. And not only that, we were able to look at their emails, and they are expressing sort of elation about how well their strategy is working. There's one email where an executive from this company is talking about how we once thought video games would be drawing people away from shooting, but now we see it's the biggest draw for new shooters. So people playing these video games are getting introduced to these types of guns, and then when they come of age, buying them.
Sounds like they just took a page straight from the cigarette industry, the tobacco industry.
Yeah, I certainly think that gun control activists would draw that parallel for sure. Joe Camel and all that sort of thing. And yeah, for sure. What's interesting is, right, that's targeting a whole new demographic, right? So for a while, it was, people buying AR-15s were kind of guys who knew about guns, right? Guys, and people who bought these AR-15s, just to speak a little about them, why they buy them. Maybe they buy them because of political fears. Maybe they buy them for other reasons. But once they buy this gun, what's interesting is they like it, because Stoner designed a very good gun to shoot. It's easy to shoot. Like, it's not hard to learn to become an expert marksman with this gun.
Anybody can shoot it.
Yeah, I mean, you shoot a traditional hunting rifle or a shotgun, it's going to give your shoulder a good pound. This thing is very easy to shoot.
That doesn't happen. There's not a huge kick to it.
No, there's barely any recoil. And so this is important in several ways, right? Stoner designed it this way because it would be easy for soldiers to shoot in the midst of battle, right? The semi-automatic version is very appealing to consumers because it's easy to shoot. You feel like an expert marksman. And then, the tragic outcome of that, it's also very easy to shoot for these isolated loners who want to wreak havoc on our society. I mean, it's remarkable. We read through we've covered all these mass shootings, and we'll talk about that probably next. But the shooter in Uvalde who massacred a bunch of children in Texas, he had never shot a gun before in his life. And he picks up an AR-15 that day and he kills all those kids. So the gun is incredibly easy, lightweight to shoot.
I'm assuming you talk to many people who do own this AR-15, and you said it's easy. Is that the appeal to what do people use it for? I mean, you're certain, is it just protection? I'm assuming most people who own it use it for protection, but you're not going to use it to hunt, or would you use it for sport? Yeah,
so they did surveys of AR owners over the years, and the first thing in the around 2010, 2011, when it was really getting popular, the first reason for owning an AR-15 was to go target shooting. People like to use it for target shooting. And then for self-defense, as people call it, people keep it in the home. There's a big debate about whether it's actually good for that, because its bullets has high velocity bullets and they can sail through walls, which is something typically you don't want. But what's also interesting is once people buy them, they realize they can modify them. They call them Legos for adults or Barbies for men. And that's a big appeal. There's guys who like to tinker with their cars on the weekend, their motorcycles, and this fulfills that same need. If you're into guns and you like to tinker around with something, you can replace all the parts. There's no other gun like it in that way. So that's another appeal. And then there's a big political appeal, right? It becomes a symbol where you're saying, I support the Second Amendment, and that's why I'm buying this. And no, you can't have my gun. And there is a segment of people who buy this gun that believe that that this is the type of gun they want if society collapses or something like that.
How much does the gun cost?
Oh, they're now, I mean, it's gone from this niche product to one that everyone makes, right? As we said before, the assault weapons ban went into effect, there's about 400,000 in the country. Now there's 20 million in circulation. And so the price has come down a lot. So you can get them from a couple $100s to a couple thousand, depending on what you want. You can buy them in parts. You can build them yourself. They're ubiquitous. They're everywhere. And that's part of the issue with mass shooters, right? One of the things that we discovered is that mass shooters often do not have criminal records, and they can walk into any store and buy these. And because they're so low priced and ubiquitous, easy for them to get.
Can you print them? And I say that as somebody who doesn't know very much about guns and knows nothing about 3D printing. I do know that parts for guns have been printed. Can you print an AR-15?
Yeah, I believe people are doing that. I don't know how reliable those guns would be over the long term, but certainly people are doing that. And you can also make them at home just by buying different parts as well that are made out of metal.
Now, on this time frame that we've been talking about, especially sort of from the maybe 80s, 90s, and then through the war on terrorism, do we see a spike in which the AR-15 specifically is being used for mass shootings?
So it all begins in 2012. Before 2012, the AR-15 had been used in just a handful of mass shootings. But beginning in 2012, there's this dramatic shift. And that begins with the Aurora, Colorado shooting. This was at a movie theater where Batman was premiering, and this grad student who was having a lot of psychological troubles went in and just massacred. I mean, he killed 12 people and injured 70 more. And after that, it really catches on as the gun that's being used by mass shooters, to the point where in the past couple of years, half of all mass shootings where 4 or more people are killed in a public place, the shooters are using AR-15s. So why do they do this? It's a really grim subject, and I don't want to go into too much about, these killers, because I don't believe they deserve a lot of airtime, but we need to understand them in order to stop the problem. And so why do they are attracted to this gun? One, because in some cases it makes them feel tough. It's this martial looking gun. And the kid in Aurora talks about this. He felt like a guy who knew about guns holding this black gun. That's a very psychological effect. Another reason they buy them is because other mass shooters have. The Sandy Hook shooter, they found on his computer, they found a spreadsheet of every mass killing, the type of gun, how many people they killed. So these mass shooters, they study each other, and they know what the other mass shooters have used. They want to try to, it's a sick game of one-upsmanship, where they're trying to kill more people than the last guy. And then the other reason is because they're seeking infamy. So a lot of mass shooters are isolated young men who are suicidal, but they want to go out with kind of a bang. I don't know how to describe it. It's really sick, but they want to get as much attention as possible when they kill themselves in this very sort of public suicide. And the way to get the more attention is to kill more people. And so they believe that this is the gun that they can use to kill more people. And then lastly, as I talked about before, the gun is just really easy to shoot. You don't have to be a trained marksman or anything to shoot a lot of bullets.
The issue of airtime, I want to ask you, did you or your co-author Cameron McWhirter do any kind of survey about the effects of airtime? And I ask this because this is just a subjective feeling I have, but I've come sort of to think after time that the amount of airtime given to mass shootings plays a role, I think, of what we've seen in society with more mass shootings later. I mean, it's just wall-to-wall coverage everywhere you look for days on, for days at a time. Was there any kind of survey or study or anything out there that talks about airtime?
Well, certainly there's been research on what's called the contagion effect. And after a mass shooting, there's a higher likelihood that there'll be a couple more mass shootings. And that's because people who are, in that headspace where they think this is the only way out of their troubles, they read about it, they hear about it. And certainly there's a contagion effect. And I think we're conscious in our book to try to glorify these guys. We try to minimize them, not use their names, all that sort of thing as much as possible. At the same time, if we want to solve the problem, we need to know what the problem is.
And I'm not even trying to glorify them. I just wonder sometimes what the role of news media is.
Yeah, that's a great question.
In the societal dynamic that we have. Yeah. Again, it's just, wall-to-wall coverage for days. What does that do to a nation's psyche? But again,
I think that's one of the reasons also we wanted to write this book, right? So we're part of I'm a Wall Street Journal national reporter, so is Cam. And the last 10, 12 years, we've spent a lot of time flying into places that have been rocked by mass shootings. So you go in, I covered San Bernardino, Las Vegas, Sutherland Springs, and it's just this really sickening cycle, right? People come in, you read about the victims, you read about the shooter, there's vigils, the president visits, but then the news vans leave, right? And one of the things that I really wanted to highlight in this book was what happens after the news vans leave. Over the years, I became friendly with people who survived these mass shootings. And to me, that's the most heart-wrenching part of this, is seeing how much their lives are altered. In our book, we follow a woman after she survives the San Bernardino shooting. And, she goes through 60 surgeries, thousands of hours of physical therapy.
Is this when was this over her pelvis?
Yeah. So this story really illustrates the way the AR-15 works. So this is a lady named Valerie, and she was a county employee in San Bernardino, and she was at a holiday party. Like, what a mundane thing, right? She didn't even want to go to the holiday party. And all of a sudden, these two black-clad attackers come in, and they're just open fire. She gets shot once in the shoulder and once in the pelvis. And I just want to take a moment to describe the way that the AR-15's bullet works, so we can describe her injuries, which is that people think that the AR-15 is a high-powered rifle. That's not true. So the AR-15 shoots a very tiny bullet, very tiny, but it has a lot of powder, right? It's a big casing. So it shoots it at a very high velocity. And what that does is it maximizes what they call the injury potential, these wound ballistics experts, of this tiny bullet. So the tiny bullet flies nose first through the air, and when it hits the body, it goes unstable, and it spins like a top. So it does a lot more damage than you would imagine from such a tiny bullet. And that was really something that the military tested and tried. They sort of researched this bullet, and something that Stoner talks about a lot, right? It's this tiny bullet, but it gives a big punch for how little it is. So Valerie, she's this woman who comes from a Greek family. She's loud, she's boisterous, she's funny, she loves to cook. She's great with people. She, needles people, makes them feel good. She has a granddaughter, she has a son, and she's looking forward to retirement. All of a sudden, she's on the floor. She's pretending to play dead, hoping that these shooters will move on. And that moment, 2 easy pulls from an AR-15 completely changed her life. Her pelvis is shattered, like just smashed. There's bone shards, there's bullet fragments everywhere. Her insides are torn up. And I first met her a year after the shooting. I met her in her backyard, and she couldn't move her arm or her hand because her nerves had all been damaged. She couldn't walk because her pelvis had been shattered. And one of the most just striking things about her injuries was that because of the way her pelvis had been damaged, it started to grow these extra bones. Her doctors didn't know what they were. They would take these x-rays of her pelvis. She would tell them, it hurts to sit down, it hurts to walk. And they looked at the x-rays, and there was these stalagmites, these tree roots of bones growing out of her pelvis as it tried to heal. And the doctors had never seen anything like that. But they consulted with military surgeons who had seen things like that from soldiers on the battlefield. And it's a type of very strange, it's called heterotopic ossification, very strange deformity of the bones as they grow where they're not supposed to grow. And it's because of the high velocity of the bullet that hit her. And her doctors described it as like her body having a hysterical response, trying to heal itself too much. And so we looked at her. She gave us great access to her medical records, her doctors, and they told us about having to go in and chip away at her pelvis for hours. They took off a couple pounds of extra bone. And, this is just one of the 60 surgeries she had. And her story is really, it's really quite sad, but also inspiring, right? So there's certain moments along her journey of many years trying to recover where she does these very normal things that we would find to be nothing, but are just huge victories. She's standing in her kitchen and she unwraps a granola bar with both hands and eats it without thinking about it. She had never done that in years. And she walked into her hand therapist dancing and wiggling. She was so happy. What she realized, she's a very hardworking woman. She always told her employees, any big problem, you solve it by eating, eat the elephant one bite at a time, as people say. And she just decided she would take on recovery as a full-time job. And that's what she did. Every day she woke up, went to therapy, got ready for operations. It was a full-time job for her. And I think we really wanted to show people, what is it like to survive these wounds when after the news vans leave, after the media is done with its daily coverage? What is it like for these people to survive every day?
I have never been to a site or a place after a mass shooting in the wake of the devastation. But I wonder, as an media observer and a consumer, but also a media worker, I've always felt a bit uneasy about the media spectacle that happens in these places. With the people that you've talked to afterwards ever express things concerning how they became ground zero for a country in a media extravaganza?
Yeah, I think especially, I feel like reporters have gotten a little more sensitive over the years, but certainly in the early days when mass shootings were first becoming a big thing, survivors especially felt besieged. You think about, you just had the worst day of your life and you're grieving and you've been traumatized. So everything hurts at that moment for those people. And having the media come in certainly doesn't help in all cases. And in some cases, people like it, right? They want their stories to be told. They want people to know what happened. But in other cases, it just adds to the pain.
Zusha Elinson has been our guest. Zusha Elinson is a reporter with the Wall Street Journal, and along with his colleague at the Journal, Cameron McWhirter, have authored the book that we have been in conversation about. It's called American Gun, The True Story of the AR-15. Zusha Elinson, I thank you very much for taking this time to join us today.
Oh, Mitch, thank you so much for the conversation. I really appreciate your thoughtful questions.